that, I'll let Max and Dillon share with you the real meaning of what I've been vaguely hinting at. They are on the board of directors with Fertile Grounds, a nonprofit which is asking questions about our relationship with life on the planet and the effects that the societies and institutions we work with have on the rest of life on the planet. And they've come up with very different answers to those questions than much of the rest of our society does, and have some fairly interesting and thought-provoking ideas to share with us. And with that, I think I'll let them take it away.
Thanks, John, for introducing us. Again, my name is Max Wilbert. This is Dillon Thomson. We're part of a local nonprofit called Fertile Ground. And we're here tonight to talk to you about the modern environmental movement and its past and what we see as its future. I think we each have a reason for being in this room tonight. Every environmentalist that I know has experiences in their past of connection with a certain forest, an animal, some experience that led them to this work. And I want to briefly share my experience with you. I grew up in Seattle, and each summer my family would go on vacation to the Olympic coast, to the beach. We'd hike out the 3 or 4 miles through the rainforest, and we'd spend a week setting up our tents on the sand, walking on the beach, and just sitting around the fire as the sunset faded. It was here that I first saw an otter swimming on its back and cracking open shellfish with a rock, and that I first saw gray whales breaching and playing in the surf. Now this place is on Macaw land. It was the site of a village for 6,000 years if you believe in carbon dating, and for much longer than that if you believe the myths and stories that the Macaw people tell. And so often as I would sit around the fire with my friends and family, I'd think to myself, how many thousands of generations have sat in this exact same spot on this same beach with their friends and family next to a fire? And how different were their lives from mine? And at some point, I'm not exactly sure when, I began asking myself, why do we go back to the city? I knew that life on the beach was better, right? There was none of the pollution, no cars, no concrete, no poverty, none of the issues that I saw in the city. It was just the sand and the unbelievable diversity of life, the shellfish, seals, otters, whales, mink, the list goes on. So I asked my parents, why do we go back to the city? And of course, they just laughed at me and brushed off the question. But I still think it's an important question. I think children often ask these important questions that there are no easy answers to. And each year as we drove out there, we drive by new shopping malls, new clear cuts, new expanses of pavement. So as I grew older and I learned more, I began to realize that there were forces, cultural forces, political forces, that were behind this relentless expansion that I was seeing year after year. And I think many of us in this room have had the same realization. The reason we are here tonight, me and Dillon, is that those forces have become so pervasive and so malignant that they are threatening life as we know it on this planet. Now, the modern environmental movement is almost 50 years old if we take the publishing of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring as the beginning. 50 years of environmental activism, and yet almost every measurement of the environmental health is in decline. I'm here because of every one of those 120 species that was driven extinct today. 120 unique ways of experiencing the world, and each creature within those species, each with their own life, their own intensely different experience. Forests around the world continue to be pulled down, grasslands, prairies, savannas continue to be ripped up. Frog populations are collapsing, bird populations are collapsing, shellfish populations are collapsing, eelgrass populations are collapsing. Indigenous people continue to be driven off their land. In almost every way, the planet is worse off than it was 50 years ago. In fact, David Brower, he was the head of the Sierra Club for many years, and he founded a lot of organizations, including Friends of the Earth Island Institute, the League of Conservation Voters. he was the most important environmentalist of his time, you might say. And before he died in the year 2000, he was quoted as saying, "All that I did in my career was to slow the rate at which things are getting worse. All that I did in my career was to slow the rate at which things are getting worse." And so this begs the question, why, despite the work of so many important people, so many dedicated people like David Brower, like Rachel Carson, why are all the indicators of ecosystem health headed in the wrong direction? Why is it that our victories are usually temporary and defensive, whereas the damage that is done by this culture is usually permanent and offensive? Whenever we succeed in protecting a certain forest, a certain stream, a certain meadow, the destruction seems to just accelerate somewhere else. And so the direction of this presentation tonight is simple. We want to reintroduce the political element into the discussion of environmentalism and ecology. It is our position that the majority of environmentalists lack a foundational understanding of the political, what it means, why it is important, and how it affects the work we do. And we believe that if this continues, environmentalists will continue to be misguided and largely ineffective. And at this stage, being ineffective is not an option. At least it's not for me and Dillon, and I don't think it is for anyone in this room.
All right. So what exactly is political? We're not very interested in nailing the idea down to some narrow definition because the concept is extremely broad. But for our purposes here, we can understand political to mean a couple different things. First, political refers to the process by which we as a society make decisions. Wound up within this is the point that some individuals have more of a say in these decisions than others, and that imbalance is called power. Some people have more power in this society than others, and generally, since the agricultural revolution onwards, that power has been held by a smaller and smaller portion of the population. The second aspect of the political has to do with the kinds of decisions that a society must make. How will resources be collected and distributed? Are we going to get our food by using agriculture or horticulture? Can an individual receive benefits from the overall work if they're unable to contribute personally? These questions are political questions. Now, this is where it gets most relevant to you as Huxley students and faculty. When we talk about environmentalism and ecology, we're talking about our relationship to the living communities around us and how we want to situate ourselves within the larger biotic process. We're talking about the complex interchange of resources and energy between our bodies and the rest of the world. So we see, by definition, the fields of environmentalism and ecology are eminently political. You can't have a Huxley College of the Environment without the political element deeply embedded in almost every class, every lecture, every presentation. It's inherent in most any discussion of environmentalism. Now, when most of us hear the word politics, what do we think of? Bipartisan issues, right? It should be clear to you now that by definition, bipartisan issues constitute a very small part of politics. And thank God, because if Democrats and Republicans were the only things in the political world, I wouldn't blame anyone for wanting to be apolitical. But they're not. In fact, I think bipartisan issues are more of a distraction away from the crucially political aspects of life today. Now I want to come back for a minute to the issue of power. What we've learned is that power is the most important part of politics as it relates to environmentalism. And yet it's a critical analysis of power where most environmentalists and many progressives fall short. To illustrate this, I'm going to move on now to one of the strongest conceptual tools that I know of, the liberal-radical distinction. I can't begin to tell you how much time, how much wasted energy this chart has saved us. If you can really absorb this, you'll be light years ahead of other people, even those who have been doing environmental work for decades now. So we're distinguishing here between two theories and practices of social change. And to clarify, we didn't make this up. This division is historically established within social theory. And rather than define each position at the outset, it's best to run through the differences between the two positions, and then it will make the most sense to you after we're finished. Now, the first point of difference between the liberal and radical approach is their conception of the basic unit of social change, on what is the primary social actor in social change. For liberals, the basic unit is the individual. The idea is that social change happens incrementally, person by person, much like links in a chain. Society is seen simply as an amorphous collection of individuals, where the sum of these individuals is still equal to the parts.
Okay, well, radicals would disagree. For radicals, the basic unit is the group or class. This position can be seen throughout history. Look at slave rebellions. They aren't simply a random collection of individuals. They're a group which shares a specific oppression under a certain distribution of power. Radicals believe that when people come together as a group, their power has the potential to multiply. The sum of a group can be greater than its parts. Now this flows nicely into the next point between the two, idealism versus materialism. This might be the heart of the liberal radical distinction. For liberals, social change is primarily an idealistic process. It happens in the mind. The common example we see of this is the sole focus put on education by most liberals. The argument runs, knowledge is power. If we educate the children, then they'll do the right thing, etc. Well, this is true to a certain degree. Max and I are here right now to play a role in political education. But taken by itself, it leads to ridiculous conclusions. Consider one approach that has now permeated the environmental movement, that social change happens through a shift in consciousness. When 2012 comes, the planets will realign, our thought patterns will shift, and this will lead to the end of capitalism and domination culture. I just recently saw a quote from Maya Angelou, who has done great work, but this particular quote of hers is a great illustration of the liberal perspective. She said, if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude. Now let's insert a concrete historical example. Would we ever say, if you don't like slavery, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude? I hope not. I think we'd say, if you don't like slavery, change it. And if you can't change it, abolish it. And if you can't abolish it, regroup, learn from your mistakes, and try again. The point is that in the face of large oppressive systems, we cannot rely solely on education and attitude change. There must always be a confrontation with systems of oppressive power. So throughout the culture, we find this liberal model being pushed onto us. And this often comes in the form of historical revisionism. Think about the way that the West has played off of Gandhi while disregarding the role of Bhagat Singh, the freedom fighter who led the more militant wing of the Indian resistance to British imperialism. Liberals and progressives have privileged Gandhi in his narrative so as to erase from memory the more radical aspects of the Indian resistance. And the same is true of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. in his narrative have been privileged so as to erase from memory the more militant side of the struggle manifested by groups like the Black Panthers and the Deacons for Defense. When in reality, Deacons for Defense. When in reality, neither Gandhi nor Martin Luther King could have done what they did had it not been for the militant sides of their respective movements. Because militancy has a very important role to play in many social struggles, and we can see that throughout history. Now, I'm not saying that attitudes can't be a source of oppression. Harriet Tubman said, "I freed thousands of slaves. I could have freed thousands more if only they knew they were slaves." Radicals don't argue that ideas aren't important in the process of social change. Of course they are. But they do argue that they aren't the primary force of social change. The position of radicals is instead known as materialism, and it encompasses the knowledge that we're not simply oppressed because of our ideas, but that there also exist concrete systems of power that are actually oppressing and exploiting us. Workers aren't exploited because they fail to identify with class interests. They're exploited because they're forced to work under capitalism, under wage labor. The same is true with women. Women aren't oppressed because they fail to recognize themselves as an autonomous group. They're oppressed because men are committing endless acts of violence against them as a class under patriarchy. So now Max will go on to the second half.
Okay. So if you take a step back and you really examine the liberal trend, you'll find that it bases itself on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. Now, there's a large portion of environmentalists who say things like, if we only can adequately explain to people in power the real situation, if we can tell them about climate change, if we can tell them about soil erosion, species extinction, they will realize that what they're doing is wrong, they'll have a change of heart, they'll stop the destruction. Now, frankly, I think this is an ignorant position. It ignores the system of social rewards. It ignores the fact that the economy